The rain over Southampton in the autumn of 1943 did not fall gently. It struck the tin roof of the Supermarine Aviation Works with a relentless insistence, as though time itself were pounding on Britain's last remaining margin for error. Each drop echoed through the vast hangar, merging with the hiss of steam, the metallic clatter of tools, and the low murmur of men who knew the war was entering a phase where hesitation could no longer be afforded. Beneath harsh industrial lighting, surrounded by scaffolding and oil-stained concrete, sat the aircraft that was supposed to define the future of British air power. The Spitfire Mark 21 gleamed under the lamps, sleek and predatory, its long nose hiding an engine so powerful it had become the aircraft's greatest enemy. To the men who built it, the Spitfire was more than aluminum and rivets. It was memory. It was survival. It was the aircraft that had held the line when invasion loomed across the Channel. But now, in 1943, that legacy was under threat, not from German fighters, but from physics itself. Squadron leader James McKinnon dropped down from the cockpit ladder, his boots hitting the hangar floor with a heaviness that matched his mood. His flight suit clung to him, damp with sweat despite the cold air creeping in from the open doors. When he removed his gloves, his hands trembled slightly. Not from fear. Not from nerves. But from exhaustion. Flying this machine was no longer about skill or instinct. It was about brute strength, about wrestling something that actively resisted being controlled. Chief Engineer Malcolm Whitfield approached, clipboard tucked under his arm. He had overseen countless test flights, but the look on McKinnon's face told him this one had been different. Worse. How bad? Whitfield asked quietly. McKinnon exhaled slowly, as if reliving the flight cost him breath. At 350 she wants to roll left hard enough to put me into a spin. Above 400, it's not flying anymore. It's fighting. The torque feels like it's trying to twist the nose clean off. No pilot alive could keep her straight in combat. Whitfield didn't argue. He didn't need to. The data already told the same story in cold numbers and jagged graphs. The Rolls-Royce Griffin engine, the most powerful piston engine Britain had ever built, produced nearly 2,000 horsepower. That power should have been salvation. Instead, it had turned the Spitfire into a barely controlled animal. Every revolution of the massive propeller generated an equal and opposite force, twisting the airframe violently. At low speeds, pilots could compensate with rudder and muscle. But as speed increased, the forces multiplied exponentially. The faster the aircraft went, the less controllable it became. It was the opposite of what combat demanded. Germany faced similar issues. Their Focke-Wulf fighters struggled with torque as power increased, but German doctrine accepted compromises. Britain could not. The coming invasion of Western Europe would demand absolute air superiority. Any weakness in the RAF's frontline fighters would be paid for in blood. Production schedules loomed. Hundreds of Griffin-powered Spitfires were already planned. The Royal Navy's Seafire variant depended on the same engine to match American carrier fighters in the Pacific. Failure was no longer just an engineering problem. It was a strategic threat. 15 miles away, in a cluttered office filled with blueprints, slide rules, and cold teacups, Joseph Smith sat alone with the same problem gnawing at him from every angle. Smith was 42 years old and already known throughout the aviation industry as a man whose mind operated differently. He understood airflow not as theory, but as instinct. Where others saw limits, Smith saw interactions. Relationships. Forces waiting to be redirected rather than suppressed. For a week, he had studied the flight test data in silence. Bigger rudders added weight and drag. Structural modifications weakened the airframe. Adjusting propeller blade angles offered marginal improvements while creating new vibration issues. Every conventional solution failed because every conventional solution tried to fight torque rather than eliminate it. Slowly, reluctantly, Smith allowed himself to revisit an idea that had lived at the edge of his thoughts for years. An idea so inelegant, so mechanically audacious, that even he had dismissed it as impractical. 2 propellers, mounted on the same shaft, rotating in opposite directions. Contra-rotating propellers. Instead of one propeller absorbing all the engine's rotational energy, 2 would share the load. Torque would cancel itself out. Thrust efficiency would increase. The engine's fury would finally be harnessed instead of resisted. When Smith presented the idea to his colleagues at Rotoll, the reaction was swift and merciless. Senior engineers called it absurd. Production managers called it impossible. Test engineers worried it would tear itself apart under combat stress. The Ministry of Aircraft Production dismissed it outright. Wartime Britain demanded simplicity, reliability, speed. Smith's proposal promised none of those, only risk. But Smith trusted the physics. The calculations were brutal but honest. The system would add nearly 200 pounds. It would require a gearbox of unprecedented complexity. Manufacturing tolerances would need to be pushed to their absolute limits. Yet the reward was undeniable. A 15% increase in thrust. Complete elimination of torque reaction. A Spitfire capable of reaching its true potential. In November 1943, Smith stood before a long mahogany table in London, surrounded by men whose decisions shaped the war itself. Air Marshal Wilfred Freeman listened with a face carved from fatigue and experience. This was not the first bold idea he had heard. Many had failed. "You are proposing," Freeman said evenly, "the most complex propeller system ever fitted to a fighter aircraft. At a time when delays could cost U.S. air superiority." Smith spoke calmly, carefully. He explained gear trains, differential rotation, planetary systems. He explained that complexity was not enemy, uncontrolled force was. When asked if he was certain it would work, Smith did not hesitate. "I stake my career on it." Silence followed. Then, reluctantly, approval. One prototype. One chance. No delays tolerated. If it failed, the project would end, and Smith would be remembered as a man who gambled too far. By February 1944, the modified Spitfire sat on the Boscombe Down airfield, its twin propellers dominating the nose like something alien. Test pilot Geoffrey Wellham approached it with the caution of a man who understood that experimental aircraft were unforgiving teachers. At 24, he had already survived combat over Britain, France, and Malta. He trusted his instincts, and they told him this aircraft would either make history or kill him. The engine fired. The sound was wrong. Not broken, different. A complex harmonic instead of the familiar pulse. On takeoff, something extraordinary happened. The aircraft tracked straight. No rudder correction. No fight. For the first time, the Griffin's power felt civilized. At 300 miles per hour, the Spitfire was magnificent. At 370, it tried to tear itself apart. Violent vibrations shook the airframe so fiercely that Wellham could barely read his instruments. He throttled back and landed immediately. The system had solved torque, but awakened something worse. Harmonics. Resonance. Invisible forces no calculation had fully predicted. In the emergency meeting that followed, tempers flared. Months of work had nearly ended in catastrophe. Many wanted the project terminated immediately. But Wellham surprised them. "Below 370, he said quietly, "it's the best Spitfire I've ever flown." Smith listened. He already knew the answer. The problem was not the idea. It was refinement. Blade geometry. Gear ratios. Harmonic frequencies interacting at extreme speeds. Given one final chance, Smith and his team worked without rest. Blades were reshaped by hand. Gear ratios recalculated to shift resonance outside operational ranges. Each component was balanced to obsessive tolerances. The work was slow, exhausting, and utterly unforgiving. On March 18, 1944, the Spitfire flew again. This time, the climb was strong. The vibrations never came. At 400 miles per hour, the aircraft was steady. At 410, it felt smoother than many fighters at half that speed. In dives, it passed 450 without protest. When Wellham landed, he removed his helmet and looked directly at Smith. "This," he said, "is the finest fighter I have ever flown." Joseph Smith's stupid idea had worked. The contra-rotating propellers transformed uncontrollable power into dominance. Though jets would soon redefine air combat, this quiet revolution proved something timeless, that victory often belongs not to safe thinking, but to those willing to challenge the forces everyone else accepts as impossible to overcome.